Hello and welcome back to the REFramework training. Now that we've modified the getTransactionData state with the appropriate logic to correctly retrieve transaction items from a local Excel file, let's continue building our automation project by diving into the process_transaction_state. In this video, we'll invoke the data processing activities and configure the mechanism for catching business rule exceptions. Be sure to keep the checklist in mind. As we build our project, we can use it to ensure that we don't leave out any configuration steps. Now, let's concentrate on process.xaml file invoked in the process transaction state. As we already know, this workflow is used to execute the major steps of the business process. In our case, it's used to type the data from the Excel file into the UI demo application and to click Accept. First, let's go ahead and change the type of the argument in_transaction_item to data row instead of queue item. Second, let's implement the logic with the actual processing steps. Because this workflow is empty by default, here we invoke the pre-configured UIDemo_addTransaction.xaml file. Remember that we've prepared this workflow in advance, so it's not part of the template. Notice that the input arguments are of the type decimal. For that reason, we need to extract the values from our data row and convert them to decimals. To do this, we'll create the three variables of type decimal: cash in, on us check, and not on us check. And then add a multiple assign to retrieve and convert the transaction item values. Now we'll assign to the cash-in variable the result of the expression CDEC in transaction item with key cash-in. This expression returns the value for the cash-in key from the transaction item and it converts it from the object type to the decimal type. Let's add the same for the other two fields. We can simply copy and paste the expression and change the key to on us check and not on us check. Of course, let's not forget to rename the activity. Third, we need to implement the business logic required to verify that the input data is valid. Consider the business rule that we have. The rule states that if the total amount entered for a transaction exceeds 10,000, then it must not be processed automatically and should be checked by a human. When the robot encounters this situation during processing, it will need to throw a business rule exception. Of course, this check will occur before typing the values into UI demo. We'll create a separate sequence for this. Let's rename it to Input Data Validation. And add an annotation to explain the business rule. The sum of all three fields must be less than the threshold. Before we start working on this sequence, do you remember where we've defined the threshold? Or what activity must we use to define and trigger the business rule exception? We'll get to the answers in just a few moments, but before that, we'll use an assign activity to compute the sum of the values stored in the transaction item. Cash in plus on us check plus not on us check, and assign it to a new variable that we create now, transaction sum. Of course, we need to change the type of transaction sum to system.decimal, and let's not forget to rename this activity as well. Next, we need to check if the transaction sum is greater than the value assigned to the manual transaction threshold key in the config file. So, let's add an if activity. The condition is transaction sum is greater than in config manual transaction threshold. To be able to compare it, let's go ahead and convert the second element to a decimal. And once again, we'll rename the activity. Moving forward, if the condition is true, we use a throw activity in the then branch to throw the business rule exception. We'll rename it and add an annotation to explain why this business rule is thrown. Of course, we also need to define the new business rule exception. We throw a business rule exception where we add a custom message stating that the sum of the values associated to the transaction item exceeds the maximum value allowed by the threshold. Okay, so if the data is not valid, then it'll throw a business exception. But what happens if the data is valid? Then the automation will process the transaction, and we do this by invoking the UI_demo_add_transaction workflow. This workflow takes 3 input arguments of type decimal, cash in, on us check, and not on us check. Now we just need to map them to the workflow variables. For the out_transaction number argument, let's create a new variable to store its value, transaction number. Let's go ahead and save this workflow as well. And with this, we've completed configuring the process.xaml file and the entire project. Before we end the video, it's important to point out that we've implemented best practices throughout this part of the process as well. We've added meaningful names for the activities used and annotations to explain each step. Great! With this, we conclude building the UI demo process using tabular data. One last thing left. In the next video, we'll run our process to see how it performs. We encourage you to review the business process, transaction data and process section of the REF without queue items checklist. Here are a few reflection points after building this process. What modifications did we implement for the process.xaml file to work correctly when reading the data from an Excel file? Where did we define the business rule? What activities did we use to configure the business rule? Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy automation!